Okay, so medical mycology, I teach mycology in the fall and then medical mycology in the spring. And that is fungi that infect people, like yeast infections and toenail infections, and then worse things that you inhale into your lungs that are really bad. I teach plant-microbe interactions, plants and interacting with fungi and bacteria and nematodes and such. I teach something we now call 21st century mycology, which is literature-based. I have taught food and industrial mycology in the past, plant biology and organismal biology, and I also teach Latin and Greek for scientists, which I may someday offer online. So when we're done, you can tell me if that would be something that you might be interested in. So we learn about scientific names and what words mean, and it really helps my students to learn the scientific terms and scientific names for things. If you come to LaCrosse, I will take you to see the world's largest six-pack. So this is, as part of the brewing process of this particular beer, they age it in these giant beer cans. You can see the regular size light pole there. Here's where you come up to get your free beer. No, that's not true, unfortunately. Okay, so I like to look at old stuff, and this is from a book called Common Sense in the Household, a manual of practical housewifery by Marion Harland. So you can see this is from 1873. So things have changed quite a bit since then. But Marion Harland wrote about this. Let's see, I'm missing the top here. Not being ambitious of martyrdom, even in the cause of gastronomical enterprise, especially if the instrument is to be contemptible, rank-smelling fungus. I never eat or cook mushrooms. And so that's one view from 1873. Most of the time, especially in those days, Americans are afraid of mushrooms. And so that probably comes from the British, because many parts of the world really relish, so to speak, mushrooms. Okay, this is the first person known to die from mushroom poisoning, poisoned by eating fungi. Blessed are the dead that die in the Lord. So this is a very old stone. I'll zoom in on it. And I can't remember the year, it is 1580. And so, people have known about poisonous mushrooms for a while. Okay? Associated with these mushrooms are old wives' tales. So this is my grandmother who's making an appearance here. She passed away in 1963, so I never really knew her. But she was very wise and knew about mushrooms. She was an Italian immigrant, and she was apparently the one who welcomed all the immigrants to the neighborhood and helped them to get their citizenship papers and get jobs and everything like that. So that's pretty cool. But she was also wise, and Grandma said, those are toadstools, you better not eat them. So here is Gyromitra brunescens, or Bruni actually, and this proves that Gyromitra is a toadstool. And so many Gyromitra species contain something that's very close to being rocket fuel. And so we do not recommend eating those. But I understand there are some Gyromitras in the South that people eat regularly. And I don't know if Gyromitra caroliniana grows in Georgia. I assume it does. Okay, so when I was looking for pictures on the internet, there was this contest from worth1000words.com where they had this mushroom and they asked people to Photoshop stuff into this. So these are some toadstools being shown here. So this will appear again later. This may also be a toadstool. This is from the shirt of someone I said I would never reveal who it is. Okay, another toadstool example that the doctor wanted. In reality, toadstool comes from the German Toadstuhle, which means death chair or death stool. And so something akin to this. And so when the English heard this, they bastardized the word, and they heard toadstool. And so then all kinds of myths grew up around the toadstool name. So grandma said to cook the mushrooms with a silver coin or spoon, and if the coin turns black, the mushrooms are poisonous. So I wondered if people still believe this, and there are people still believe this. So here's Marianne Harland in the Practical Housewifery book. Boil mushrooms with a white onion and stir them with a silver spoon, she cautioned. If the onions turn black or the spoon darkens, throw everything away and be properly thankful for your escape. So this is not true. I don't know how many people died from that. She offered many recipes in this book, and she said that the poison types sport all colors and are usually far prettier than their virtuous kindred. I sort of like that style of writing. Maybe we should go back to that 1873 stuff, but with actual facts. Okay, so here is alpha-amanitin. This is the toxin that's in the death angel, or the destroying angel, if you like. So it's a very small molecule it's a little tiny protein. And so these are your liver cells on normal liver cells, and these are your liver cells when given this amanitin. And so it destroys the DNA replicating machinery in the liver. So the liver is filtering out stuff. And so this is where, the toxin accumulates and the liver cells die. But it takes a while for that to happen. And so you get the delayed effect for 1 or 2 days before you get any symptoms at all. Okay, so there have been, a couple names rolling around for this. Amanita virosa, Amanita bisporigera. And you all are familiar with this, with the vulva at the base, the ring around the stalk from the secondary veil, and then the free white gills that are on here. So, and they grow on the ground. Okay, so it turns out that Amanita virosa and Amanita bisporigera are the same species. And so the only thing you could tell the difference was between the four-spored versus the four-spored basidia. But if you look at, here's my tattoo of Amanita bisporigera, and you can see the basidia on there. Some of them are two-spored, some are four-spored. So now my tattoo is tax deductible. Okay? And so it turns out, I'm not going to go into the technical details of here, but this is what happens in the basidia in making 4 spores versus 2 spores. So the 2-spored basidia they've already found a mate, and the ones that come from the 4-spored basidia have to find a mate. And so that's a whole lecture in itself, but it's pretty interesting to see what that means in terms of the genetics of it. Okay, so the correct name is the older name. So Amanita bisporigera is the older name. And so the correct name for the 4-spored form, which used to be called Amanita virosa, is Amanita bisporigera variety tetraspora. So the 4-spored, 2-spored Amanita. So science is weird. Okay, unfortunately, the fungi do not tell us their names like this, so you have to be able to identify it. If you're going to hunt mushrooms, you need to be able to identify the poisonous ones so that you don't eat them. And so there are poisons every year from this fungus in the United States and throughout the world. Also from Amanita phalloides. That might be slightly more common than this one. So that's Amanita phalloides, which is green, the death cap. And it still has the white spores, not as much of a veil, and it usually has kind of a green tinge to it. And they could be really big, and so I've seen some that are 1.5 feet tall. I don't know if you got these in Georgia, but they've been it's not a native species, but it's been brought in on both coasts and is heading toward the Midwest. So I know it's in the like southern Illinois, but we don't have it in Wisconsin or Minnesota yet. So here's an email I got. Hello, I was wondering if you could help me out. I am a teacher in Manitowoc, Wisconsin. Just today, a teacher's aide told me about mushroom hunting this past weekend. She told me how she knows if a mushroom is good or bad. The mushrooms she picks are white and have a single ring below the crown of the mushrooms, and said that if there's a second ring on the stem, that is called the death ring. Could you tell me what kind of mushroom she's eating and is safe in the way of identifying mushrooms to eat? So this person is in trouble because they could be eating Amanita bisporidea. And so, you know, people, the Dunning-Kruger effect is real. And so people have a little bit of knowledge and they think they know everything, but well, there's so much to know. There have been stories of people identifying mushrooms from the encyclopedia, picking out one page has the good mushrooms and one has the poisonous mushrooms, and it looked more like the one on the one that said that it's edible. So this is not good. For a while, if there was a mushroom poisoning in the United States and people died, you could be pretty sure it was recent immigrants from Southeast Asia. And so the Amanita phalloides looks a whole lot like something that they eat in Southeast Asia. And so there had to be a lot of education to be able to prevent these deaths. You hear about whole families of Hmong people, especially dying from this. So got to be careful if you go to another country to see what you're going to actually eat. Grandma said that all mushrooms growing on wood are edible. And that's kind of an Italian tradition. Grandma was Italian. And so, but that's not true. So this is Omphaliotis illudens, for example, the jack-o'-lantern mushroom, which is one of the most common causes of poisoning in the United States. For some reason people confuse these with chanterelles when they're really just because they're orange. And so these are, they cause gastric upset, so can cause projectile vomiting and projectile diarrhea at the same time, which is not as pleasant as it sounds. There are deadly ones. This is Galerina autumnalis, or relative, living on wood. And it has the exact same toxin as the death angel. So don't know whether this is some kind of convergent evolution or what's gone on with this. But you know, this is easily identifiable by the little ring on the stalk, brown gills that are attached, rusty brown spore print. And you have to be careful when you're picking them. So which one of these is edible? So if turns out that one of these is Armillaria, honey mushroom, and one on this side is the Galerina. And so sometimes what has happened in the past is that people are picking honey mushrooms and you sort of get bored with it for after a minute, and you're just picking, you know, honey mushroom, honey mushroom, honey mushroom, Galerina, honey mushroom, Galerina, honey mushroom, Galerina. And so you don't look at, some people don't look at their mushrooms carefully when they get back, and they might have a Galerina mixed in with their honey mushrooms. And so this is, I've heard of several times this has happened. Okay, so spore print color is different. The veil is different. Everything is different, but it looks kind of the same from the top. Okay, Grandma said that all mushrooms contain amanitin, the toxin. And this actually comes from a paper published in the 1960s that said all mushrooms contain amatoxins, all mushrooms. And so this contributed to mycophobia in the United States yet again. And so this lab was testing all the mushrooms for amatoxins. And it turned out that all of their glassware was contaminated. They didn't wash it enough between samples. And so every single piece of glassware in their lab had alpha-amanitin on it. And it survives autoclaving and cooking and everything else. So, but they were not washed. And so no one could repeat it, and found out that they, you know, everything was contaminated in their lab, and they withdrew the paper. But, you know, the scare gets the big headlines, and the withdrawal gets a note on the back pages. So another scare here. Okay? Grandma said that touching mushrooms can poison you. So don't touch those mushrooms because you'll die. And so what's the caption for this picture? Caption, who's going to speak up? Nobody's going to speak up.
Don't touch that with a 10-foot pole.
There you go. So Cornelia wins. And so this is my friend John Rippon, medical mycologist. And so here we are with our stick and the death angel right here. And so it's not true that touching this will harm you. So it's impossible to absorb enough of the stuff through your skin. So the LD50, so LD50 is the lethal dose at which 50% of the population dies. And so the LD50 for ammonite is 1 milligram per kilogram, which is really small. Okay, so it's 1 part per million. So depending on your body weight, you'd have to eat about a half of a cap to kill you. Okay? But I do not recommend that you take the mushroom and you squeeze it and you make a juice out of it or anything. I know someone who did that trying to make an extraction, and she got some symptoms. She got really quite dizzy from it. So don't know what's going on with that, but just touching it isn't going to harm you. There are, however, some mushrooms that people are allergic to. And one common mushroom that people are allergic to is Swillus americanus, which grows only under eastern white pine. And so this is the chicken fat mushroom. And Swillus is identified by its pores that are kind of parallel to one another, kind of like gills. And then this is one that grows only under eastern white pine. And so I know several people who, if they touch this, they will get an allergic reaction, sometimes within minutes. And so and it's an edible mushroom, but I don't think it's very good. But your mileage may vary. When I touch it, I feel like my fingerprints are gone. And so I don't know what's going on with that. I'm not allergic to it, but it feels like a kind of waxy that my fingerprints are gone. So maybe that's what you do if you're going to rob a bank or something. Okay. Grandma said to watch the animal because they know what they're eating. So she said if the slugs, the deer, and the squirrels are eating the mushrooms, they must be okay for us to eat. Okay. And so my grandmother used to feed the mushrooms to the cat. And if the cat was alive the next day, they would eat the mushrooms. And so you can find whatever you want on the internet. And so I guess they went through a lot of cats. Our grandma was good at mushroom taxonomy because nobody ever got sick from her mushrooms that I know of. And it turns out that although alpha ammonite affects dogs and they die from it, cats do not have there's no effect on cats. And so grandma was lucky or very good. I'm not sure which. And so there you go. Here's some slugs eating some mushrooms. Don't know whether they're edible or toxic from this because slug metabolism is way different than ours. And so don't know. They don't have much of a liver. So maybe they can eat a death angel. This is a Russula, but you get the idea. So this is a slug fest. You can often find them. Slugs really like Russula. And there's a giant slug from the Northwest, which are fun to find and kind of toxic. Okay, so here is a scene in Wisconsin in a spruce forest. And actually, this looks like moss in here, but every one of these is a spruce seedling. And so these Russulas were here. You can see the area that they're in. And there was a bite taken out of every single one of them. But nobody ate the rest of them. So I suspect they were about the size they would be deer bites. So some deer went in there, tasted every one of them, didn't like it, or didn't taste like anything, and they went on. So here's a squirrel eating a mushroom. And so You say, "Now, the squirrels are eating it, must be okay." Well, first of all, you don't know what happened to that squirrel afterward. And squirrel metabolism is different than ours. So unless you keep the track of every squirrel in your yard, is this the same one that ate the mushroom that you see again? So don't know the answer. So here's our photo contest again, and this squirrel is eating this mushroom to hallucinate. And so I have seen squirrels guarding their cache of Amanita muscaria up in the crook of a tree and yelling at me if I'm going anywhere near it. And so, you know, that's not evidence that they're getting high from it, but I think they're getting high from it. So it's well known that reindeer eat these hallucinogenic mushrooms like this, you know, the Amanita muscaria. It's sort of ironic that every artsy-fartsy depiction of mushrooms is this, which is hallucinogenic typically, and the reindeer eat it. So there's a reindeer trying to get the hallucinogenic mushroom. I don't think it's ever going to get it, but there you go. So the reindeer will guard their cache of hallucinogenic mushrooms in the tundra. This is my favorite Christmas decoration. It's about a foot high or so. My mother got, and it came this way with Santa Claus sitting on top of a hallucinogenic mushroom. And so there is some, I hope I'm not going to spoil it for anyone, but there are some theses that say that the Santa Claus myth came from a cult based on hallucinogenic mushrooms. And so you have the mushroom is red and white, Santa's red and white, there's reindeer flying around, there's elves making toys and things like that. And that kind of sounds like a hallucination to me. So there's a nice book by Larry, his head name was just in my head. Larry Mueller from Boston.
Larry Millman.
Millman, thank you, sorry, thank you. So grandma said, and she probably really said this, mushrooms have no nutritional value. So lots of books, websites say that mushrooms have no nutritional value, cookbooks and everything else. So a lot of that is based on mushrooms in a can. And so mushrooms in a can probably have little nutritional value, just like the green beans you get out of a can really aren't that nutritious. And so, you know, you lose a lot when you're processing them. So fresh mushrooms certainly have a lot of good nutrients in it. And so edible mushrooms, of course, are delicious and nutritious. That's why many of you are here. They have a protein profile that is very similar to beans and actually has a better amino acid ratios of the things that we need than beans do. They have a lot of B vitamins in them, and considering where they grow, it's not too shocking. There are a lot of minerals in mushrooms. And so, you know, there are lots of really good mushrooms that are good for you. And so, you know, if you look at the amount of protein in these different mushrooms, it's pretty significant. Okay, so here are some edible mushrooms. And you can name them in your head, or you can log on, put your voice on for a second and say what they are, but I guess you can't do that because you're all blocked. So these are morels, giant puffballs, which I'll talk about later. There's a quarter there. King boletes, Laetiporus sulphureus, chicken of the woods. These are matsutake, which is more of a northern fungus. And it is very much prized by people from East Asia. And so, especially Japan and Korea. And so this little mushroom right here without the veil open would sell for probably $100 in Tokyo. If you could get it there in this shape. So it's a very delicious mushroom. It requires very little cooking and it's way different. So, oops, I went too far. Here are some chanterelles. You're going to have chanterelle season pretty soon. It takes another month or so for us. We're in the middle of Mycena season, which is not exciting. Black chanterelles, honey mushrooms, cultivated mushroom like shiitake, and these are lobster mushrooms, and this is a lobster. So I've given 3 times again a workshop on the coast of Maine, and we always have lobster. So sometimes we have lobster mushrooms too. Okay, there are also truffles. So this is a dinner I went to in Slovenia in 2007. And there's an international group here. And so we went to the inn, this inn in the middle of nowhere, and had truffles. So these are the black truffles that were out at the time. This was in September, late September. So black truffles and then white truffles. So the black truffles were selling for 300 euros a kilogram, and the white ones were selling for 3,000 euros a kilogram. And so I'll show you the 4-course dinner we had. So this was the salad with truffle shaved over the top, and this is also Amanita caesarea, Caesar's mushroom, which is the only one of the few mushrooms you should eat raw. And then here's a fresh prosciutto, which is also made by the innkeeper. Okay, the second course was this cream of celery soup. And so when you got the soup, the innkeeper came around and grated the truffles over the top, and then you stir it into the mix and then eat it. So the flavor is very volatile. Okay, so here's the main course, this tagliatelle pasta with the white truffles over the top. So same idea. The flavor is fat soluble, so it's a very creamy sauce on there. And so you put this on there, take a picture, of course, and then stir everything in. And the dessert was this a flan with the truffle grated over it, fresh fig, a strudel, and some poppy seed cake. So this was about, so the cost, including wine, I usually make people gasp, but we can't do that. It was about 25 euros. So it's about $40 at the time. So we got a real treat because the innkeeper knew some of the big wigs we were with. Okay, some of these fungi have medicinal value. So this is the famous Fomitopsis officinalis and Ganoderma lucidum, or some of its relatives there, lychee, and shiitake. So all of these have reportedly some medicinal value to them. So we go and we think about the idea of the nutraceutical, where nutrition is your medicine. And so these have been used for years in Southeast Asia, but Western medicine is kind of catching on to this now. In Western medicine, we want to have take a pill and everything's immediately better, but these are taken over a very long period of time and reportedly boost the immune system. So the same thing is true of Grifola frondosa, maitake, or hen of the woods. And so, there is something to all of this. I think we need more double-blind studies before we can say this is a cure-all for everything. So still need to be careful and still listen to your doctors. And there are many doctors who are looking at this kind of thing, but double-blind studies is my gold standard, and that's where it's at for me. And Grandma said mushrooms harbor botulism. So you should be careful not to get botulism when eating store-bought mushrooms. So botulism, you probably have heard it before if you haven't experienced it. Any canned food is susceptible to the infection by this fungus, this bacterium called Clostridium botulinum. So it's obligately anaerobic. which means it has to live where there's no air. And so a can is a perfect place for that. So sometimes you see cans that are crunched in and something has happened, and they contain botulinum toxin. So 1 microgram is enough to kill somebody. So it's one of the most toxic things known on Earth. Way more toxic than anything we've been able to create so far. And so be careful of botulism. But of course, we use this botulinum toxin to do Botox. So here's a woman getting Botox here. And so, the poison is in the dose. Always the poison is in the dose. And so because there's a little bit of something, it may not be enough to cause any kind of reaction. And so that's an important thing to remember. Okay, and so in the 1950s, there was a reported case involving fresh agaricus. And so that's why there are holes still today in each of these packages that's required to keep it aerobic. And so here's the paper. And so did this really, so they did it on purpose. They inoculated a Clostridium in mushrooms that were in the plastic film. And of course they got, the bacterium to grow. And so, this, more fear of fungi. But no one's ever found it in a natural situation where, the mushrooms were packaged. And certainly they all have holes in them now, so they're going to be aerobic. So grandma said if you get mold in your house, you should just burn it down. So you probably have heard all the horror stories, people burning down their $1 million houses. I guess that in the suburbs of Atlanta, $1 million isn't much of a house, but $1 million is a lot for a house in LaCrosse. So there are a lot of horror stories about this. Someone once sent me this from a nursery. So this is a pot. I've turned it upside down, of course, and it had a fungus growing on it. And when we did a tape mount, which you take a piece of tape and you rub it on the black stuff and see what you can get out of it, and looking in the microscope, we found it was Stachybotrys. And so it looks like this. Stachybotrys is the black mold that people talk about and burn their houses down for. It forms a bunch of spores that are in this kind of mucilaginous cluster up here at the top. And there is a known mycotoxin that occurs on the surface of them. But there is no proof that this mycotoxin can cause harm to people. So a lot of anecdotal stuff. There was a case in Cleveland some 15 years ago of a cluster of cases, and that was never proven. But here are some scenes from New Orleans after Hurricane Katrina. And so there's lots of molds on, most of the mold on the wall is Placlatosporium, which is not harmful. But this mask is probably not doing any good for anybody. This is an experiment I accidentally did in my refrigerator. And so I forgot about this in the back. I think it was some kind of corn chowder or something. But there's several kinds of mold in here. There is a red yeast that you see here. And there's a white yeast here, and it's a lot of stuff in there. So, the reason you have a refrigerator in your house or apartment or wherever is because of fungi and bacteria that are your main competition for food. And so the cold temperature slows them down. And of course, mold can grow anywhere. This is jello mold, which is a favorite of picnics. Okay, there are some fungi you need to worry about. This is dry rot. This is in the basement of a historical house on Cape Cod, where I took these pictures. And this is dry rot. So it really isn't, it's really sort of misnamed because the fungus needs water and moisture to grow. but it sends out these rhizomorphs, these structures that search for water. And so they're sending them up on these walls here and up the steps here, trying to find water. And so, you know, this is a very bad problem because it rots the wood, and then the structural integrity of the house is not so good. Okay. Other times, fungi show up in your house. So I got this, I got an email with a few pictures in it. This is the first one I looked at. I said, oh, they laid out a oyster mushroom on the floor and they got a spore print. But then they sent me these other pictures, and here's the oyster mushrooms growing on their floor. Okay, so most of them are in this, coming from the crack here. So there's severe underlying moisture problems. This one was actually growing in this spot. And so that's a big problem for this person. So I told them they need to get inspected and to figure out whether they were going to fall through their floor, because there's some heavy structural damage here. And there's a closer view. So you can see the ruler, so how big those mushrooms are. 6-inch ruler. Okay, Grandma wanted to know how she could get rid of the mushrooms in the yard or the houseplants or the mulch. Because she's afraid that the kids, the dogs, the neighbors will touch, eat, play with them. And so here is a slime mold, which is not a fungus, but here's one trying to get into the house. So obviously burglary of some sort. This is, of course, a giant amoeba, and it's crawling in there looking for bacteria, which is what it eats. So it's not a fungus because it doesn't have a mycelium. It's a giant amoeba. So people write to me and say, I have this slime mold in my yard. I have these other things in my yard. So I think to myself, so these people probably are spending a lot of money to find that one unusual plant or cultivar or something new that nobody else in the neighborhood or their garden club has. And they get something that nobody else has and they want to kill it. So I don't really have that much sympathy for them. I tell them to find a way to enjoy this. Some people say, I threw a bucket of water over it and it just got more. Well, yeah, that's how it works. Okay, so here are some other things that are in bark mulch. And so here's what the dog vomit slime mold, as we call it, looks like as it's starting to form its fruiting body. One of the dog stinkhorns, Phallus rubicundus. So here is a mutinus growing in a fairy ring. So this is interesting. So fairy rings come from inoculation from a center point, and then it grows out in every direction like it would on a petri dish. And so this is a pretty homogeneous material, and so it grows pretty evenly in all the directions. So you can see fairy rings of lots of different kinds of mushrooms in the wild and in your yards especially. Okay, other mushrooms can be a problem in your yard, and I sympathize with people like this. So this is an agaricus of some sort pushing through their new asphalt. So lots of force needed to do this. And you can see it pushing up from this angle. And you can see the size of it from that ruler. It might look like the same ruler as the other one, but this is a different person. Okay. So I don't want you to think fungi are all bad. There's a lot of beneficial fungi. The fungi benefit the trees and mycorrhizae. You probably have heard about mycorrhizae, which means fungus root in Greek. And so you can see the mycelium is on the roots, and it sends out more hyphae to help to feed the plant. And so, people want to spread fungicides in the yard to get rid of the unsightly mushrooms, but if they do that, they're killing their trees. And so, here we go. Even if this is a death angel in here, find a way to deal with it. And so here are some actual mycorrhizae on chestnut. And so these are they're kind of in water, so you can't see the hyphae going out, but this little piece you can. you know, the amount of hyphae that are going out, these threads that are feeding the rest of the fungus that's on the tree. And in return, the fungus gets sugars from the tree. So they're mutually beneficial. And Grandma said the lightning brings mushrooms. So mushrooms come up after a lightning strike. So here's a lightning strike, and I thought I heard a tree falling yesterday when I was talking with y'all, and I can't find one. And so here's a lightning that struck a tree. And so you can see this, excuse me, the size by somebody's backpack that's down here. And so, so many times there can be fruitings of fungi in this tree. This one's probably already infected with something, and the lightning destroying the tree helps it to, you know, gain access to the air that it needs to fruit. Same thing with the pieces of it. So, you know, in a sense, lightning does bring some mushrooms. You know, they can fruit in the, you know, sometimes the lightning strike is much smaller and they can fruit in that little crack. So, but the lightning itself is not the cause, it's the damage. Okay. Lightning, however, can bring fire. And in the West, we have fire morels. And so this is the worst place I ever went mushroom hunting. You know, that's a little conifer forest, about 8,000 feet in Eastern Oregon. And, you know, down trees and everything was burned. And so, and there was 6 inches of ash on the ground. So it was really dirty, miserable, ash in the air. But there were morels, and they were especially on logs, underneath logs like this, where it was just slightly wetter. And so these fire morels are an important part of the ecosystem after fire, apparently. And Grandma said that puffballs are bad. So kicking puffballs is bad because the spores will grow in your eyes and make you blind. And so I've had students tell me their parents have told them this. I think they just want them to not kick it around in their yard, but you know, you are spreading the spores by kicking it, so maybe that's helpful to it. However, I've spread puffball spores in my yard for years and I've never gotten anything to grow. Well, however, this is an article from several years ago in Wisconsin. Mushroom Lands Teens in Hospital, they inhaled spores by sniffing puffballs. So these teenagers were sold bags of mushrooms from somebody who said inhaling the spores would be intoxicating. However, they were not intoxicating, so they puffed them into their nose. And there were so many spores and such an overload that the spores started to grow in their lungs. And so these poor kids, you know, were all hospitalized. They eventually recovered because the fungus can't survive at body temperature very well. But that was a pretty big scare for their families, I'm sure. Puffball spores have historically been used to stop bleeding. So maybe you shouldn't get them in your eyes. Okay, last thing is Grandma was very wise, and she said that PCR and DNA sequencing will solve all of our fungal taxonomic problems. So in the old days, you know, DNA sequencing is a valuable tool to help us classify fungi, and you probably have heard something about this in other lectures that you've had. And then way back in the 1990s, before the turn of the century, a lot of researchers were renaming species and everything else based on a DNA sequence of a single stretch of DNA. And so this caused a lot of problems. So now we know this DNA sequence is not the end all and be all. It's another tool that accompanies looking at the fungus and its macro morphology, the microbial morphology looking in the regular microscope, electron microscope, chemical analysis, and whatever the next new thing is. So we're now looking at proteins and RNA and lots of other things like that. And so we got more tools that are helping us to classify it, and that's why there have been a lot of name changes. Some of them I agree with, and many of them I do not, and I will not use their names. So there's maybe 45 or 50 new names, genus names in the boletes, and I do not care at all about them, so I'm not using them. Okay, but here's one that's useful. This is the chicken of the woods, Laetiporus, and we saw this variation in it and wondered what was going on. And so we found out, to make a long story short, we did DNA sequencing all these and found out they were different species. So some of them are yellow pores and grow up on the tree. This is the common one. Laetiporus gilbertsonia grows on eucalyptus. This white pored one grows on the ground in the rosette. This Laetiporus conifericula grows on conifers in the west. And Laetiporus gilbertsonii variety pallida grows on live oak in the swamps in Mississippi and Louisiana. And so when we did the sequencing, we found out these were different, and this gave us the confidence to know which characters to use. Okay? And so those characters I just described, so this white pored one that grows on the ground, Laetiporus cincinnatus, is the best of all of them. Even if you're only interested in eating, this is the best one. You can eat all of it. Unlike Laetiporus sulphureus, which is more common, where you really can only eat the edge unless you find it very young. There's an undescribed species that's totally inedible. It's really bitter. And so I've seen this in Wisconsin, New Jersey, probably occurs lots of places. And then this other one, Laetiporus persicinus, turns out is not a Laetiporus at all. It belongs somewhere else. And so the DNA gave us the confidence to use our micromorphology and our geography and our hosts to be able to distinguish between the species. So to me, that is the most valuable thing for us in the DNA sequencing stuff. Okay, so we described 3 new species of chanterelles in an area probably about the size of the room you're sitting in our local forest. And so we did the DNA sequencing, found out there were differences, and that pointed us, what should we look at now to find out that these are different? And you see this one's got white gills, or gill-like things, folds. This one's totally yellow, and this one's sort of rose-colored and toward purple. And so these are all growing in the same little field. So kind of interesting. Okay, so we've learned something today, and that is old wives sometimes are right. And it turns out that old husbands were less often right, as they are today. And so thank you very much, and you can visit my web page.